The hollow frequency. The atmosphere at Blackwood Peak did not just feel cold. It felt thin, as if the oxygen itself were being replaced by something older, something that didn't belong to the lungs of the living. It was an altitude where the wind didn't just howl. It whispered in a language of jagged edges and broken glass. Arthur Penhaligon was a man who traded in silence. As a deep-frequency audio engineer, his career was built on the removal of noise, the cleaning of static, and the isolation of hidden sounds. He was hired by a private telecommunications firm to investigate a persistent interference coming from a decommissioned Soviet-era relay station perched on the highest, most inaccessible ridge of the mountain. The drive up the winding, unpaved road was a descent into isolation. The trees changed as he climbed. The lush pines of the valley gave way to twisted, blackened trunks that looked like charred skeletal fingers reaching out of the permafrost. By the time Arthur reached the station, a brutalist concrete box stained with decades of iron-rich rust. The sun was nothing more than a pale, sickly bruise on the horizon. He stepped out of his truck, and the silence hit him like a physical blow. It was a pressurized stillness, the kind that makes you hear the rushing of your own blood in your veins. He looked at the massive radio tower, a lattice of rusted steel that groaned under the weight of the freezing wind. It looked less like a piece of technology and more like a lightning rod for something invisible. The interior of the station was a cathedral of obsolescence. Arthur's flashlight beam cut through air so thick with dust it looked like gray snow. He moved through the narrow corridors, his boots echoing against the cold concrete in a rhythmic, lonely cadence. Clack, clack, clack. The air inside smelled of ozone, burnt vacuum tubes, and a faint, sickly sweet odor that reminded him of wet wool and rotting flowers. He reached the main control room. It was a graveyard of analog dials, green-tinted oscilloscopes, and miles of tangled, braided copper wire that hung from the ceiling like the entrails of a giant beast. He sat at the main console. The leather chair creaked, a dry, agonizing sound that seemed to linger in the room long after he sat down. He powered on his portable rig, the blue glow of his digital interface clashing with the oppressive shadows of the room. He plugged his headphones in. The first thing he heard wasn't the interference. It was a hum, a low-frequency vibration that started in his teeth and traveled down his spine. It was a sound that felt like it was coming from deep underground, as if the mountain itself were humming a lullaby to a nightmare. Arthur adjusted the dial, searching for the source of the interference mentioned in his contract. For an hour, there was only white noise, a chaotic sea of static. But then, at 44.4 megahertz, the static cleared. It was a voice, not a recording, but a live transmission. A woman's voice, monotone and hollow, as if she were speaking through a throat filled with silt. 7, 4, 0, 9. The door is unlatched. The hearth is cold. Arthur shivered. He hit the record button. Hello? He whispered into his own headset, a reflex he couldn't control. Is someone on this frequency? There was a long pause. The static returned for a heartbeat, and then the voice spoke again, but this time the tone changed. It was no longer monotone. It was intimate. It sounded as if she were standing right behind his left shoulder. Arthur, the voice said, you've always been so good at listening to the things that don't want to be heard. Arthur ripped the headphones off. The room was silent, but his name, continued to vibrate in the copper wires above him. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. He looked at the oscilloscope. The green line wasn't a wave anymore. It was a straight, jagged line that pulsed in time with his own quickening heartbeat. He realized then that the station wasn't malfunctioning. It was receiving, but it wasn't receiving radio waves. He walked to the window. In the pitch-black darkness of the mountain peak, he saw them, a circle of lights, miles below in the valley, flickering in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. They weren't flashlights. They were fires. As he watched, The radio console behind him began to scream, a high-pitched, piercing whistle that sounded like metal being torn in half. He ran to shut it off, but the buttons were molten hot. The plastic was melting under his fingers. The voice returned, now blaring through the station's internal speakers, shaking the very foundations of the building. The frequency is open. Arthur, the hollow is full. Thank you for bringing the ears we needed. Arthur looked at his hands. In the flickering light of the monitors, his skin looked translucent. He could see the bones shifting beneath his flesh. He could see the blood flowing, but it wasn't red. It was a dark, shimmering silver. The static wasn't just in the air anymore. It was inside him. The silence that followed the screaming speakers was worse than the noise itself. It was a vacuum, a hollow space in the air that seemed to suck the warmth directly from Arthur's skin. His heart, once a frantic drum, now felt like a heavy, leaden weight, pulsing with a slow, agonizing rhythm that matched the flickering of the emergency lights. Arthur knew he should leave. Every instinct, every primal spark of survival in his DNA, was screaming at him to run to his truck and drive until the mountain was nothing more than a bad memory in his rear-view mirror. But the door, the heavy, pressurized steel door he had entered through, would not budge. It wasn't locked. It felt as if the air pressure on the other side had increased to a point where no human strength could move it. He was trapped, and in the dark, the only way was down. He found the access hatch behind a row of humming server racks. It was a circular iron lid, cold to the touch and smelling of oxidized copper and old, stagnant water. When he pulled it open, a gust of air rushed up from the depths, air that didn't smell like a basement. It smelled like an open field after a lightning strike. It smelled like ozone and wet earth. Arthur began the descent. The ladder was a series of rusted iron rungs that groaned and flexed under his weight. Each step down took him further away from the world of logic and deeper into the guts of Blackwood Peak. The walls here weren't made of concrete. They were carved directly into black schists of the mountain, and they were covered in a fine, crystalline frost that seemed to glow with a faint, bioluminescent blue. At the bottom of the ladder, Arthur found himself in a long, narrow corridor lined with thousands of shelves. But they weren't holding files or documents. They were holding jars. Thousands of glass jars, each containing a single coiled spool of magnetic tape. This was the archive of lost echoes. He picked one up. The label was written in a cramped, elegant hand. Subject 109. Final words. December 1962. Arthur found a vintage reel-to-reel player on a stone plinth at the end of the hall. It looked as if it had been waiting for him, the power light already glowing a dull, sickly orange. He threaded the tape with trembling fingers. The sound that emerged from the speakers was not a voice. It was the sound of a person breathing in a very specific pattern. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 7. Exhale for 8. It was a healing breath, a technique used to calm the nervous system. But as the tape played, the breathing began to sync with Arthur's own. Suddenly, a second voice entered the recording. It was a woman from the radio frequency. "You're doing very well, Subject 109, she whispered. "The frequency is almost calibrated. Just one more breath. Give the mountain what it wants." There was a wet, tearing sound, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like a scream. Arthur looked at the jar in his hand. The tape inside was no longer black. It was translucent, filled with a swirling, silver vapor that looked like liquid static. As Arthur stood in the archive, a shadow detached itself from the far wall. It wasn't a woman. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was wearing the same technician's coveralls as Arthur, but his skin looked like it had been bleached by radiation. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 glowing copper coils that hummed with a low, electrical vibration. "You shouldn't have come down here, Arthur," the man said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the speakers of the reel-to-reel player. "Who are you?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking. "What is this place?" "I was the engineer before you," the man replied. "And the one before him." "We aren't here to fix the interference, Arthur. We are the interference. The mountain doesn't have a voice of its own. It needs ours. It needs our fear to vibrate the air. It needs our memories to fill the static." The man stepped into the light. His chest was open, and in place of a heart, there was a vacuum tube glowing with a brilliant, pulsing violet light. "They don't want your life," the predecessor whispered, as the violet light began to fill the room. "They want your frequency. They want to turn your soul into a number." The walls began to vibrate. The thousands of jars on the shelf started to rattle, a crystalline symphony of 1,000 trapped souls. Arthur felt a sharp, electric sting in his chest. He looked down and saw his own skin beginning to shimmer, the veins in his arms turning into silver wires. The voice of the woman returned, echoing to the stone corridor, vibrating the very marrow of his bones. 4, 9, 2, 1. The vessel is prepared. The frequency is set. Arthur tried to scream, but the only sound that came out of his throat was a burst of static. He wasn't Arthur Penhaligon anymore. He was becoming a transmission. The chapter ends as Arthur looks in the glass of a nearby jar and sees his own face staring back at him from the magnetic tape, his eyes wide with terror that will now play on a loop forever. The transition was not a movement through space, but a shift in perception. As the violet light from his predecessor's chest expanded, the stone walls of the corridor did not simply vanish. They unspooled. The black schist of Blackwood Peak dissolved into long, shimmering ribbons of magnetic tape that stretched infinitely in every direction. Arthur felt his feet leave the solid ground. He was suspended in a cathedral of static, a place where the sky was a storm of white noise, and the floor was a translucent lattice of copper ley lines. The air here didn't just smell like ozone. It tasted like forgotten memories. The copper tang of a childhood injury, the dusty scent of a first love's letter, the cold aroma of a funeral parlor. His body was no longer a solid thing of flesh and bone. When he moved his hands, they left trails of silver light, like a long-exposure photograph. He could hear his own thoughts, but they weren't silent. They were being broadcasted. Every fear, every secret he had ever buried, was echoing through the ribbons of tape that surrounded him. "You are learning, Arthur," the voice said. It was a woman again, but now her voice wasn't coming from a speaker. It was vibrating from within his own ribs. To be a transmission, one must first lose the illusion of the self. You are no longer the architect. You are the ink. At the center of this geometric nightmare sat a figure that defied every law of biology Arthur had ever studied. She was tall, impossibly so, her body composed of millions of fine, silver wires that pulsed with a rhythmic bioluminescent glow. She sat before a loom that spanned the horizon, but she wasn't weaving thread. She was weaving human lives. This was the weaver of static. Her face was a blank, polished mass of obsidian, but as Arthur approached, the surface of the mass began to ripple. It displayed his own face, then his mother's face, then the faces of people he hadn't thought of in 20 years. "Why?" Arthur tried to ask, but his voice was a distorted burst of 60 hertz hum. The weaver did not move her mouth, yet the answer resonated in the very marrow of his spectral bones. "The universe is a chaotic noise, Arthur. It is a scream without a mouth. My task is to find the signal within the noise. But the signal requires a medium. It requires the high-voltage tension of human terror to keep the threads from snapping." She reached out a hand made of twisted copper cables and touched Arthur's chest. The pain was not sharp. It was an expansion. He felt every moment of his life being pulled out of him, sorted, and woven into the great loom. He saw his 5th birthday, his first day at the firm, the moment he decided to take this job, all of them being turned into a sequence of numbers. The Weaver gestured to the sky above. Arthur looked up and saw millions of tiny, glowing spheres, each one vibrating at a different frequency. These are the number stations, the Weaver explained. What you heard on the radio was just the exhaust. The real transmissions are being sent into the deep cold of the cosmos. We are not communicating with other people, Arthur. We are broadcasting the data of humanity to the things that wait in the dark between the stars. Arthur saw a sphere that pulsed with familiar rhythm. He leaned in and heard a voice he recognized as his own, but younger. 5, 1, 0, 8. The shadow is tall. The shadow is me. He realized with a jolt of pure, crystalline horror that he had been broadcasting from this station for decades. The Arthur who lived in the world, who worked as an engineer, who drove the truck up the mountain, that was just the echo. The real Arthur had always been here, trapped in the loom, serving as the battery for a signal that would never reach a human ear. The Weaver began to tighten the threads. Arthur felt his consciousness fracturing, being split into 1,000 different frequencies. He was the static. He was the hum. He was the silence between the numbers. The Weaver's obsidian mask turned back to a flat, reflective surface. The calibration is complete, she announced. The interference has been cleared. Arthur felt himself being pulled back, not toward the surface, but toward the radio console in the control room. He felt the cold plastic of the headphones against his ears, the smell of burnt vacuum tubes filling his nose once more. But he wasn't sitting in the chair. He was inside the headphones. He looked through the glass of the oscilloscope and saw a man sitting at the desk. The man looked exactly like him. The man reached out, adjusted the dial, and whispered, "Hello? Is someone on this frequency?" Arthur tried to scream a warning to himself, but all that came out was a monotone, hollow sequence. 2, 0, 7, 6. The engineer has arrived. The cycle begins again. With a close-up of the new Arthur's eyes, which for a brief second reflect a violet light that doesn't belong in this world. The sun rose over Blackwood Peak, but it didn't bring warmth. It brought a flat, artificial glare that made the world look like a low-resolution photograph. The Novo Arthur, the version of him that had just woken up at the console, stepped outside the station to breathe the morning air. But the air didn't move. The wind, which had been a predatory howl only hours before, was now a loop recording of a breeze. He looked at the trees. They were perfectly still, their leaves frozen in a mid-air dance. When he reached out to touch a trunk, his hand didn't meet rough bark. It met something smooth, cold, and slightly vibrating. The forest was a facade, a stage set constructed from the memories the Weaver had harvested. Inside the station, the original Arthur, now a ghost in the machine, watched his double through the lens of a security camera. He tried to manifest, to scream, to short-circuit the monitors, but he was nothing more than a sequence of data. He was a ghost, and the man outside was a shell. Arthur Ghost watched Arthur Shell return to the kitchen to make coffee, but there was no coffee in the pot. Arthur Shell simply mimicked the motion of drinking, his throat swallowing air, his face reflecting a satisfaction that wasn't real. The simulation was breaking. The Weaver was recycling the data too quickly, and the edges of the world were starting to fray. Arthur Shell sat back at the console. He felt a nagging sense of wrongness, a splinter in his mind that he couldn't extract. He began to run a diagnostic on the equipment, but the numbers on the screen didn't make sense. 1 + 1 was no longer 2. It was Arthur. The coordinates for the relay station weren't degrees and minutes. They were the date of his father's death and the latitude of his first house. "Who am I?" Arthur Shell whispered to the empty room. From the headphones sitting on the desk, a voice responded. It was his own voice, distorted and layered with 1,000 years of static. You are the placeholder, Arthur. You are the shadow cast by a light that went out a long time ago. Arthur Shell grabbed the headphones, his eyes wide with a realization that was both terrifying and inevitable. He began to tear at the console, ripping away the plastic panels. Behind the wires, there was no circuitry. There were only rows of glass jars, identical to ones in the archive, each one pulsing with the silver vapor of a stolen life. He realized then that the station wasn't on the mountain. The station was the mountain, and he was just a subroutine, a fragment of code designed to keep the signal stable, while the Weaver prepared for final broadcast. The walls of the control room began to turn transparent. Arthur Shell looked out and saw not the forest, but an infinite grid of identical stations. In every window of every station, another Arthur was sitting at another console, tearing at the same panels, discovering the same jars. It was a factory of souls, a mass production of suffering, all tuned to the same frequency. We are the choir, the voices of 1,000,000 Arthurs whispered in unison to the intercom. We are the harmony for the song that ends the world. The original Arthur felt a surge of cold fury. If he was data, he could be a virus. He began to pour his consciousness into the power grid, trying to overload the system. He forced every memory of pain, every spark of genuine human spite he had left, into the Weaver's loom. The lights in the station began to strobe, violet, then black, then a blinding, electric white. Arthur Shell fell to his knees, his body flickering like a failing television set. His skin began to peel away in digitized squares, revealing the glowing copper coils beneath. The Weaver of Static appeared in the center of the room. Her obsidian mask was cracked, and a liquid, silver static was leaking from the fissures. For the first time, she sounded agitated. "The signal is becoming unstable," she hissed, her voice a cacophony of 1,000 radio stations playing at once. "The medium is resisting." Arthur Ghost pushed harder. He didn't want to escape. He wanted to destroy. He wanted to burn the archive and silence the frequency forever. Suddenly, the original Arthur felt a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't the Weaver. It was the predecessor, the man with the vacuum tube in his chest. "Don't just break it, Arthur," the man whispered. "Redirect it. Send a message they didn't prepare for." Arthur Ghost and Arthur Shell reach out to each other, one from the screen, one from the chair. As their fingers touch the glass of the monitor, the entire station begins to dissolve into a blinding explosion of white noise. The final sound is not a number. It is a word, a name, but it isn't Arthur's name. It's yours. The explosion of white noise did not lead to a death, but to a birth. As the fingers of the two Arthurs touched through the glass of the monitor, the reality of Blackwood Peak shattered like a mirror struck by a hammer. The concrete walls, the rusted towers, and the infinite grid of identical stations dissolved into a singular, blinding point of light. Then there was the void. Arthur found himself standing, if standing was still a word for existing in a space without gravity, in the center of the Weaver's loom. But the loom was no longer a machine of silver wires. It had become a bridge of pure consciousness, stretching across the cold, black ocean of the cosmos. The Weaver of Static stood before him, but she was no longer a goddess of copper. She was small, withered, and ancient, a creature of shadow clinging to the last remnants of a dying fire. "You've broken the loop," she whispered, her voice no longer a broadcast, but a dry rasp of wind. "The signal you sent, it wasn't number, it wasn't data. It was a scream of defiance. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Arthur looked at his hands. They were solid again, but they were composed of the stars themselves. He could feel the pulse of distant galaxies in his veins. "I silenced the lie," he replied. "No," the Weaver hissed, pointing to the darkness beyond the bridge. "You've called to the listeners. and they had been waiting for a reason to stop listening and start arriving. The sky above the void began to tear. It wasn't a rip in fabric, but a displacement of reality itself. From the silent spaces between the stars, things began to emerge. They didn't have shapes that the human eye could categorize. They were geometries of shadow, vast architectures of hunger that moved with a terrifying, silent grace. These were the owners of the frequency. For eons, they had been content to sit in the dark, fed by the steady stream of human suffering, fear, and memory that the Weaver had curated for them. They were like a king listening to a court jester. As long as the jester kept singing, the king stayed in his throne. But Arthur had silenced the song. He had replaced the rhythmic, predictable data of the number stations with the raw, chaotic, and unrefined truth of a soul that refused to be a battery. The things in the dark were no longer entertained. They were curious, and their curiosity was a force that could erase planets. Arthur felt the weight of their gaze. It was a pressure that made his starlight skin crack. He saw the earth, not as a blue marble, but as a flickering, fragile candle in a hurricane of ancient shadows. The Weaver had been a jailer, yes, but she had also been a shield. By keeping humanity trapped in the frequency, she had kept them hidden. Now, the door was wide open. Arthur realized that there was only one way to save what was left. He couldn't go back to being a man, and he couldn't stay as a ghost. He had to become the signal itself. He turned to the Weaver. "Teach me," he said. "Teach you what?" she asked, her form fading into the dark. "How to weave a lie so big it can hide a world." Arthur stepped into the center of the loom. He felt the silver ribbons of magnetic tape, the lives of millions, rushing through his mind. He began to pull the threads together, but this time he didn't use fear. He used the one thing the Weaver never understood, the mundane, the quiet, and the beautiful. He wove the sound of rain on a tin roof. He wove the smell of a Sunday morning. He wove the feeling of a hand holding another hand in the dark. He created a new frequency, a static of peace. He broadcasted it with every ounce of his being. He sent it out into the deep cold, a shield of white noise that made the earth look like nothing more than a dead, empty rock to things that watched from a void. He turned the world into a ghost, just as the station had turned him into one. The pressure vanished. The geometries of shadow retreated back into the silent spaces, unable to find a signal to latch onto. The earth was safe, hidden behind the wall of Arthur's sacrifice. Back at the station on Blackwood Peak, the snow began to fall for real. It wasn't digital snow. It was cold, wet, and silent. A new engineer, a young woman with a bag of tools and a thermos of coffee, stepped out of her truck. She looked at the station, which was now just a pile of rusted metal and concrete, long abandoned. There were no lights, no monitors, just the wind. She walked to the old radio tower and looked up. For a second, she thought she heard something, a faint melodic hum coming from the wires. She pulled out her receiver and tuned the dial. Static, pure, unchanging white noise. She smiled, feeling a strange sense of peace she couldn't explain. She didn't know that she was living inside a masterpiece of a lie. She didn't know that every breath she took was a note in a song being played by a man who was now the very sky above her. But as she turned to leave, the static on her receiver broke for a fraction of a second. A voice, clear and warm, whispered just one thing. "Stay quiet. I'm still listening." The screen fades to black. The final sound is not a whistle or a number or a scream. It is the sound of heart beating, once and then perfect silence.
If you have a strange experience or a story you can't explain, leave it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Until the next video, stay safe.